So just letting you know that this presentation is being recorded. Also, all participants will be muted for the duration of the program. Please take a moment to locate the participant and chat function on the Zoom platform. And the chat function will allow you to participate in the webinar, and to send a question or comment, just use the chat box. But we also ask you to reserve kind of prolonged discussions until the end of the presentations. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can email me at stephanie.bilke@audubon.org, or you can send me a private chat in the chat box. So anyone joining by phone, my email is stephanie.bilke at AUD as in David, UB as in boy, ON as in Nancy.org. And I'll pass it back to Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. And I'm really excited to see so many participants. I guess when we originally planned this, the last time we had this meeting in person, it was a much more intimate group. So we had the opportunity to go out around and introduce everyone, but I think I'm going to forego that because right now we have about 93 participants. So, so I guess y'all can just sit back and relax and enjoy the presentations. We've got 6 presentations lined up for the first part of the session, and then we are going to end with about a half an hour of open discussion. And I want folks to be thinking about, you know, how we can apply these radar and acoustic tools to better address some of the applied research needs of resource managers and conservation practitioners that are, you know, part of the network, and also be thinking about how we can integrate, you know, the strengths of these tools with the other initiatives. And so I'm hoping that's going to be kind of the focus for the discussion afterwards. But of course, you know, we'll also be open to asking questions. So for the presenters, they're about 15 minutes a piece for the presentations, and hopefully the presenters will leave a little bit of time for folks to ask questions. But otherwise, you know, put your questions in the chat like Stephanie had asked, and I guess we'll go ahead and get started with our first presentation. It'll be, oh, the other thing is, it's nice that we have kind of a dynamic group of folks at different points in their career. So we've got some, you know, graduate students to more seasoned researchers here. So we're going to start with Jessica Outcalt, who is a recent PhD graduate from Purdue University in the Department of Forest and Natural Resources. And in fact, her project is probably one of the sort of the poster child projects of the network that really was sparked from one of the earlier meetings at the network. We were able to connect and develop her dissertation project together. So it really stemmed from sort of the network. And I know, Jessica, we've got a couple manuscripts that are out in review right now. So it's great to see this work come into full fruition. So I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's great to be here. Let me share my screen. Hopefully this works like it did when I tested it. All right. Yeah, hopefully you all can hear me all right. My computer's been having some microphone problems, so yeah. But to get started, so like Jeff said, I just finished my PhD from Purdue University. I worked under Barnardine Dunning there, and my dissertation was about stopover ecology of migratory birds in Indiana. Some of you might have known me as Jessica Tinklenberg. I'm now Jessica Outcalt, just to clear up any confusion about names there. Yeah, to kind of get started about my talk today, I'm going to be talking about some of the background for this study, a couple of my research questions, then get into what I did and what we found. So to get started with some of the background, So as many of us know, migratory bird populations are declining. This has been kind of well established by a lot of really important papers, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But this is kind of the justification for why we need to study migratory bird populations. Identifying where and how those populations are changing is a really important part for migratory bird conservation, so that we can really target conservation efforts, especially when dollars are limited. So like I said, I did my PhD at Purdue, so I used the Midwest as a case study. This is actually a really unique area to study stopover ecology. It's a fragmented matrix of agriculture and urban and forest landscapes. So it provides a really unique opportunity to study a lot of interplay between different land management practices. Weather surveillance radar, which is what this symposium is kind of focused on, can answer a lot of these really kind of broad scale questions, which is really exciting. That's something I hadn't really used or heard about until I came to the first Midwest Migration Network conference, October 2016. Heard Jeff Buler talk about radar and I was hooked. So this can answer questions of where birds are going. It can answer questions of how many birds there are, in addition to a whole other host of topics that we'll be hearing about today. So to get into what I studied specifically, I'm going to be talking about two of my research chapters today. My third project looked at some eBird data, and that one's I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today, so I'm going to focus on my first two research chapters. First, how have migratory bird populations changed in Indiana over the last decade? So looking at essentially the numbers of birds. So weather radar, if you aren't aware of how radar works or kind of how it's handled, it's been archived back to about the mid-90s. It's a national network of these radar stations, so you can access data as old as 20 years ago. So we used a 10-year time frame just to kind of get an idea of how many birds are in the airspace. And then we also looked at what habitats are migratory birds using during stopover and what factors are driving some of those habitat use patterns. So to get into what I did, weather radar can be kind of challenging to work with. It's a fun challenge. I really enjoyed it, but it can be kind of complicated. So I'm going to walk through this kind of step by step. So radar starts as this raw data. When you go and look at a radar screen on your weather app, you can see typically they filter out some of the clutter. So what we do is we go back in and get that raw data from the National Weather Service. We then remove any of that weather patterns. So meteorologists want to see the rain. We want to see everything but the rain. And then we remove any nights that were contaminated with insect contamination, clutter from large buildings, or just bad days. Even radars can have bad days sometimes. The technical term for this is anomalous propagation, which is where atmospheric conditions cause either over or under refraction of the radar beam, which essentially causes the radar to look funky. So that's the very non-technical interpretation of what's going on. So once we've removed some of these contaminants that we don't necessarily want, we're then left with bird data. There's probably some bats left in there, but largely it's migratory birds at that point. And this is data from spring and fall migration. So we used April and May, and then September and October from kind of a 10-year kind of staggered gap. So 2005 to 2007, 2010 to 2012, and 2015 to 2017. And then we isolated data across those seasons to the time period just after sunset. So as many of us know, migratory birds typically migrate at night, and they leave en masse from stopover sites just after sunset. So graphically, this looks like this really nice spline curve of bird density right after sunset. There's billions of birds in the airspace. So we isolate the radar data to just after that time period. So we're getting a picture of birds that are taking off from stopover sites. Then we use some algorithms that were developed by the University of Delaware, Jeff Buler's lab, as well as several other groups that I'm very thankful for their pioneering work in that. And this corrects for the curvature of the Earth across the radar, kind of the radar domain. And then once we've done that, we can summarize the radar data using a regression on order statistics approach, which is great for multiply censored data, which is what this has been. And then we end up with the processed data. So I have a couple figures that I'll show and a couple slides that'll show what this processed data looks like. And then as far as my specific projects, once I got that processed weather radar data, I was able to track changes in bird densities. So this was spring and fall migration across the 2015 to 2017 timeframe. And then because we were looking at data right when birds were taking off, this allowed us to identify factors influencing site use. I was really interested in both habitat characteristics, so the amount of forest cover on the landscape, the amount of agriculture on the landscape. But I was also really interested in seeing whether or not some urban landscapes and patterns within urban landscapes played a role. So I took data from the US Census. This is at the census block group level, looking at socioeconomic patterns. So the median income in a neighborhood, human population density, and several other factors that I'll go through shortly. And then I also looked at the amount of bright lights in the air. So artificial light at night has been shown to disorient and attract birds into different migratory habitats. So I wanted to see if bright lights from cities within Indiana, such as Indianapolis or Fort Wayne, would be influencing migratory bird habitat use. And then I was able to summarize those trends and habitat use. So that leads into the results. So my first question was, how many birds are in the airspace? So I used a full linear model looking at bird density. So this was the density of birds leaving these stopover sites with year, so over time, season between spring and fall, habitat within these broad habitat types, forest, urban, or agriculture. And then I looked at a couple interactive effects. So overall, we found that birds were declining. Year was a significant predictor in this model. And this is about a 7% annual decline across our 11-year study period. So over time, we found that birds were declining. This was statistically significant. And this paper is currently in review. So hopefully we'll hear back about that paper shortly. So this was birds leaving stopover sites. I also used data from Kyle Horton and a couple other collaborators looking at the traffic rates of migratory birds. So this is taken from about peak migration during the middle of the night, looking at how many birds are flying over stopover sites. So essentially just the rate of how many birds are in the airspace. So this, I also ran a full linear model looking at the effective year and season. So between spring and fall, because this traffic rate data set is not spatially explicit, besides being the two radars, I can't differentiate between habitats. But what we found was that the traffic rates of birds were declining, but only in autumn migration. And this was a lower degree. So this was around a 2% annual decline rather than a 7% like the stopover data showed. So one possible explanation for this difference in results is that fewer birds are stopping over in Indiana rather than flying overhead. So one interpretation is possibly that birds are treating Indiana and other agricultural areas in the Midwest as barriers to be crossed rather than good stopover habitat, which raises some concerns for conservation and kind of thinking about how we can protect our migratory birds. And then I was also interested in where birds are going, so what stopover habitats they're using. So this is a map so this is what the radar data looks like once you process it. So this is Indiana. If you're not familiar with Indiana, I'll kind of break it down where some of these hotspots are. So red means more birds, blue means less birds. And this is over 3 time frames. So you can kind of see visually that decline in birds over the last 10 or 12 years in Indiana. This is at the census block group scale, so looking a little more coarsely, but which allowed us to bring in some more covariates, which was really important. So these areas highlighted in red are urban centers. That's Indianapolis at the southern radar and Fort Wayne at the northern radar. Birds were using urban areas in fairly high densities. This has been pretty well understood that birds are using urban areas. No one's really looked at where specifically within urban habitats birds are going, especially using weather radar. And then, as we expected, birds were using some forested habitats. So these are big state parks, national forests that have been protected and are excellent stopover habitat. So as expected, birds were using these habitats. And then this graph, I always love putting up here. It's really complicated when you first look at it, but I'm going to break it down and so we can get an idea of what's going on. So the y-axis is essentially number of birds at stopover. So this is the number of birds leaving stopover sites relative to each of these different covariates. So distance from radar, these are arranged from most important to least important, left to right and then top to bottom. So distance from radar was the most important. This is essentially a nuisance variable that we use to capture any remaining spatial bias from weather radar. But then the next most important variable was the size of a housing unit, which is really interesting, and not many people have looked at housing units relative to migratory bird stopover. So essentially how big a house is, how big an apartment is, can really interact with the number of birds. So there were more birds at smaller housing units, which is often apartment complexes, small housing units in part of a larger building, so maybe college dorms, apartment complexes, and so on. We saw more birds at areas of higher forest canopy, as expected, but then also kind of this peak really at low forest canopy covers, which we interpret as being in these urban areas. We saw more birds in areas of higher human population density, as well as more birds in wealthier neighborhoods. So more birds in these areas of higher income. We saw fewer birds in areas of higher agriculture, as expected. And then this result with impervious surface was interesting. We saw a lot of birds in areas of high impervious surface, which again could be related to urban areas. Birds seem to associate more with newer housing units, as well as close to bright lights at night. So kind of summing this up and pulling out kind of the highlights, these red circles are kind of implying birds are using urban areas, as well as forested areas in the green circle. So that was a really interesting kind of finding that not many people have really looked at. So we were really excited to see some of those results, which will allow us to kind of narrow in on conservation implications. So moving forward, as far as the discussion portion of my talk, we found that migratory birds are declining, especially in urban habitats. This could be related to some age-specific patterns. There's one study that found that I think younger birds were more attracted to artificial light at night. So it could be that these younger birds are getting attracted to these urban habitats, and that's resulting in a maybe ecological trap of some sort. It could be related to anthropogenic factors such as increased risk of building collisions, predation from domestic cats. Other human-related factors such as that. And this really highlights the importance of these small habitat patches like backyards and parks. If birds are being attracted maybe on a landscape scale to artificial light at night, as they resample within these urban habitats to wealthier neighborhoods or areas with more apartment complexes that might have more landscaping around them, the importance of these small habitat patches really becomes highlighted in this work. We also found that, as expected, migratory birds are using stopover sites in Indiana with more forest. This is no surprise, but is again good and allows us to target conservation in especially some of these national forests in Indiana. In addition, migratory birds are using areas with smaller housing units, more humans, so that higher population density, as well as wealthier humans. I wasn't able to determine if this was a cause and effect relationship, but regardless, human socioeconomics could be influencing the ecology of migratory birds, and future research should look into some of these patterns. I think it would be a really beneficial area of interdisciplinary research between sociology and ecology. So future research, continuing to study urban and suburban stopover site behavior, looking at whether or not these urban sites are even beneficial. That could be an ecological trap where birds are drawn into urban areas but end up having reduced fitness. So the full annual cycle research is so important in this context. So to see if these urban sites are even beneficial for birds. Looking at applying these radar topics on a broad scale or even continental to identify stopover sites. So my research was solely focused on Indiana, but expanding this to the Midwest as a whole or even across the continent. Kind of in tandem with that, as we hope to scale up to stopover mapping across a broader spatial area, kind of streamlining some of the stopover mapping protocols. This was very computing intensive, which was a good challenge, like I said, but as computing and machine learning technology improves, maybe some of the streamlining of these protocols would allow us to do more of this fine scale stopover mapping on a broader spatial scale. So with that, I'd love to thank my co-authors and collaborators. None of this work would have been possible without them. Like I said, I did this through the Purdue University Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and this project was really jump-started with the Midwest Migration Network. So I'm so glad to finally share some results with you all. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Jessica. I think in order to stay on time, we'll have to push those questions back till after the presentations.
Sounds good.
All right, so next up is Emily Cohen, who is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And we're gonna sort of continue on this mapping stopover with radar theme, but moving more towards the Great Lakes and some of the work that we've been doing together. So I'll hand it over to Emily.
Emily, you're muted.
Okay. All right. All right, let's see. Morning, everybody. It's so disconcerting to talk to a virtual crowd like this, but it's really exciting to see there's like 125 of you. So everybody is pumped to be thinking about migration right now when we're all stuck in our homes. And I'm going to do exactly what Jessica mentioned in her last next step, which is scale up and talk about mapping across a broader extent using similar methodologies. And yes, this is a picture from the Gulf of Mexico because I've never done field work around the Great Lakes, and so I'll have to work on that. Oh. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, we're mapping the stopover habitat use around 7 radars that are along the coastline of the Great Lakes, very similar to what Jessica was just talking about. And then taking those data, marrying them together with a bunch of spatiotemporal covariates to model the drivers of those distributions. And then using those relationships to interpolate stopover habitat use region-wide or along the coastlines. And then I'll talk about some next steps with these projects. So I just threw this in actually just now when I saw that there were 125 of you. So I figure you're not all radar ornithologists, which is what I expected when I put this talk together. But so you've probably seen some really exciting developments lately in the field of radar ornithology with passage through the airspace. And this is a little bit different from that, where we're mapping using the lowest beam of the radar just at that nocturnal exodus, and then mapping birds back down to the landscape. And so this is using radar to map where birds are at liftoff as opposed to passage through the airspace, which I know a lot of you probably know that. These are the 7 radars that we use for this study, situated around the Great Lakes. The years are 2010 through 2013. We looked at spring and autumn migration. And the thing that this, this project adds to previous work around using 6 of these 7 radars from Archibald 2017, which I think Jeff went over in his intro to the session the other day, is adding fall as well, and then bi-weekly within seasons, and some new methodologies for the processing of the data, which are always developing. These are the covariates that we used in the models to look at the spatial temporal drivers and boosted regression tree models, where you can just throw a ton of data for really complicated interactions and nonlinear relationships. So I'm just going to dive right into the results. The first thing we did was map stopover habitat use around each of the 7 radars, similar to what Jessica just showed in the last talk. And so these are spring. I hope you can see my cursor. These are spring and fall. And the way to look at these are locally classified. And so the red, orange, and yellow are all high density sites, but they differ in variability. The red areas are where you would want to go if you were a birder. They're consistently high density, whereas the yellow areas are sometimes high density, and then the green are moderate, and the low are low. The gray are low, sorry. And so you can see that there, within these radars and between spring and autumn, there are consistent local stopover habitat hotspots. So these classifications are within, those categories are relative to the other areas around each radar. So this is not regionally classified such that this red is not relative, this density is not relative to this density, it's just relative to the other area around the Cleveland radar. So there's a lot to pull apart here in terms of thinking about local parks and local management issues around these areas. And then the second step was looking at the drivers of these patterns. And one of the questions that brought us into this project were concerns about wind development and distance from the coastline. And there were questions about 1 kilometer buffers or 5 kilometers. And so I think these data pretty clearly show that in both spring and autumn, birds are concentrated within about 20 kilometers of the coastlines. And obviously this will vary among the radars and the seasons. So this is across everything. Some of the other relationships that we found, that vegetation and hardwood forest cover were both quite influential during both seasons. So for NDVI, vegetation greenness above 0.25, which is healthier vegetation, there's a positive relationship, which ties in closely with these patterns. Positive relationship with the proportion of hardwood forest cover, which is something that's been supported for quite a few other areas. And these are the big exciting results, I think, then. And so we took those relationships from the models and then predicted out in a 1 kilometer grid around the Great Lakes. And these are true interpolation, not extrapolation, because we only interpolated within radars within a 75 kilometer distance from the shoreline. The colors are the same here in terms of categorical, with low, moderate, and then all 3 yellow, orange, and red. Those are high density areas. Just depends on how variable they are. And so you can see a few patterns here. For example, in the fall, stopover densities are shifted further north, and they're further south in the spring. But there's definitely regions where you get consistency between spring and autumn. And so the colors are a little bit different on this both seasons one, where the green are areas where there are high or moderate densities, in at least moderate densities in both seasons. And then the red are at least any high density in both seasons. So there's only 2 colors besides the low on these. But so yeah, and these are different from those first maps that I showed you, in that these are regionally classified, or these are regionally classified such that you see pretty low density down here in the Cleveland area, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of birds there. It's just that relative to the eastern coast of the Lake of Michigan, there's not as many birds stopping over. So these are pretty exciting maps to see, I think. We also looked for the first time within seasons at the density of birds stopping over through the region. And you see these peak migration periods in May and September. They're also, the axes on these are different. And so there are about 30% more birds during the autumn, which you would expect with the addition of young of the year. And so now I'm going to show you a couple of animations that depict the within season geographic variability in these same patterns. The axis does differ a bit, so concentrate on those geographic changes during every bi-weekly. So I'll show spring first, and then I'll show autumn, and I'll show it. I'll show each one 2 times. And what I usually do is sort of get the big picture the first time, and then the second time focus in on my area of interest to see how it changes. Early April. No, I'll show the fall. One more time, I think. So those are really exciting, if I do say so myself. There's obviously a lot of variability within them, and but just to be able to see where birds are stopping over at this huge extent within seasons and between seasons through the same region is a really exciting development, and we're getting close to getting this out. Then the next things to finish before we do that are we're working on incorporating over each of those 7 radars concurrent information about the flight density of birds through the night on those same sampling days, and then the height profiles and directionality to address questions about the relationships between stopover density and directionality and flight height. And then one thing we've also been working on in the Gulf, on the Gulf Coast as well as the Great Lakes, is calculating a stopover to passage ratio, which we call SPR, which is a measure of the proportion of passage migrants that stop in a given area. So we marry those two pieces of information together. And we started to do this for these, wow, I'm missing a slide. There it is. Okay. We started to do this for the Great Lakes using the Fish and Wildlife Services tracking radars. So we use their vertically pointed radar that are depicted on this map. In the areas that they sampled were green for spring and yellow for fall. And these is the coverage. You can also see the coverage area for the NexRad radar. So there's not a lot of overlap between the two. And also the temporal sampling they're in different years as well. And so what we did here was we used those interpolated maps of stopover density, and then we pulled out the mean reflectivity values around during spring or autumn around each of these sampling areas to put those together into this stopover to passage ratio, which is just stopover density divided by passage density. And the higher values indicate a greater proportion of the passage migrants stopping in those areas. So you can see here that on the eastern side of Lake Michigan, where we saw really high stopover densities, there are also very high SPR, meaning that not only are there high densities of birds stopping there, a high proportion of the birds passing over are stopping in those areas. Same for Lake Huron. Some of the issues with this measure that we want to work on are the differences in temporal sampling time, and that they're not using the passage data from NexRad. And so these are the results from the Gulf Coast that we're working on, where we've done the same thing, but with the NexRad data. So pairing the passage data and the stopover data together for each of the radars. And one of the interesting things that seems to be different for the Great Lakes versus the Gulf Coast is that in these areas we see a lot of similarity in high densities of passage and stopover, and those are decoupled from the SPR. So where you have high stopover densities, there's lower proportions of SPR, whereas the opposite is true on that eastern Lake Michigan shore. So more on this later, but just a little teaser here. So in summary, we found local habitat hotspots around radars, and there's a lot to pull apart there in thinking about the things that Jessica was talking about. And then really interestingly that birds concentrate within 20 kilometers of the shorelines. And we definitely see those highest densities along the eastern and western coasts of Lake Michigan when thinking regionally. And that was true between seasons, although spring migration densities were shifted further south. And then those really interesting within season geographic variability. And I think some of that would be really cool. I was watching the MODIS workshop yesterday, and Chris Tonwer was showing the arrows of the birds. So it'd be really neat to, in thinking about this network where we're talking in methodological silos, but thinking about how to integrate across radar and MODIS and other data types to look at bigger patterns or to complement each other. And with that, that's all I got.
Great, thank you, Emily. So we're getting a little bit behind time, so I'm gonna jump right into the next talk, which is building off of some of the data that Emily just shared with you. It will be by me. So this is actually, I'm gonna share my screen. So this is I've sort of boiled down a presentation I gave a few weeks ago at the International Artificial Light at Night Conference, and where I'm going to dive deeper into sort of these impacts of artificial light on where birds are stopping over within the Great Lakes and really just across North America as well. And this is sort of, we pulled data from various projects. So there's a long list of co-authors, and this is, a culmination of years of work from multiple projects. So I'm really excited about some of the results we're finding here. Now, it's no shock probably to anyone in the audience. I hope that we know birds have been attracted to artificial light, especially at small scales, for a long time, going back to sort of the advent of the electrification of light. So there's a nice example here in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Exposition Building that was built in the late 1800s. At the time, it was sort of the crown jewel in the nation as a sort of conference center. And they had 4 carbon arc spotlights that put out about 100,000 lumens. So it was like the brightest building at the time. And which is about equivalent to, maybe about 4 highway streetlights now. But, in a few years, we had one of the earliest sort of observations of birds, being drawn to these bright buildings and colliding with buildings from Coonline in 1888. So, so we've known about this for a long time at small scales, at lighthouses and these sorts of things. Sort of fast forward now, this is sort of what the artificial light at night landscape looks like here in the Western Hemisphere. So, and for a lot of these long distance migrants, it's during passage, during migration is really when they're encountering these bright landscapes at these temperate latitudes. So these high, like blackpoll warbler here, breed in the high boreal forests and where there's very little light pollution, and overwinter in northern South America, again, where there's little light pollution, but they have to cross over the US, which is very bright. And so more recently, we've been beginning to ask, well, is this attraction happening at much broader scales? And, here we're looking at Phoenix, Arizona from about 10 kilometers away, and that you can see the sky glow from these cities on the horizon for tens of kilometers from large cities. And so we asked whether we could see this broad scale attraction using radar data from the fall across the northeastern US. So 16 radars here in the northeastern US over a series of 7 years. And what you see on the left is sort of how we quantified this sort of attraction to light, was to look at the relationship between bird density and how far and proximity to these bright areas, and we defined bright areas as those areas where the light at night is 5 times the natural brightness. That's about when you can no longer see the Milky Way in the sky. And we did, and yes, we found actually a pretty strong negative relationship showing that bird density increases as you get closer to these bright cities, basically major cities like New York, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Boston. And it extends out over 200 kilometers, this sort of monotonic decline in bird density. So, and this is what it looks like, sort of more locally. You can see this in some of the imagery. So this is the onset of bird migration happening here on the mid-Atlantic around, I've labeled the cities here so you can see. So I'm just gonna kind of scroll through some of these images as bird migration starts to appear. We can see the southern end of New Jersey lighting up because that peninsula tends to concentrate lots of birds there, which is, you know, if you're familiar with Cape May, New Jersey, you know that's a great birding hotspot. But as we start to progress, you can start to see these yellows are the hot spots. So around the city of Dover, around the city of Wilmington in Delaware, this is the I-95 corridor that connects between Baltimore and Philadelphia, which is a lot of urban development. You can almost see the highway starting to light up, and then you're starting to see birds taking off from Philadelphia and Baltimore. They're further away from the radar, so it takes a while for the birds to show up. But even there's signal around Annapolis, Maryland here. So this is sort of a cherry-picked example that really exemplifies this sort of birds concentrating in these bright urban areas. But then we were beginning to wonder, okay, well, you know, can this vary? How does this vary across the country? And how might that vary seasonally? And so we know that young birds, you know, in the fall, we have most of the birds that are migrating are these first of year naive birds on their first migration. And they do show more attraction towards sky glow on the horizon. This was work done, you know, orientation cage work done many years ago to show that these immature, these young birds tend to orient to the sky glow on the horizon, which is depicted over here on the right, compared to adults, which move in the appropriate migratory direction. So, so we might see differences in attraction to artificial light because in the spring, age ratios are much more equal, right? There's fewer young that have either not survived that first migration and get culled from the population. They may also learn that maybe moving into these bright areas is not a great strategy. And we also have a lot of evidence that for those birds that do find themselves in these urban areas, there's really high, greater mortality risk from flying into buildings and glass or getting eaten by cats, right? So we may also see a pattern where these light attracted migrants get selectively culled from the population as they move along the migration route. So we might see sort of latitudinal changes in attraction to light as mortality in these urban areas might have a greater impact. So we can predict these relationships, again, looking at this relationship between bird density and the distance from the bright areas, we could predict, okay, we should see a steeper relationship in the fall when we have these naive young birds that are maybe attracted more to the light than in the spring, and along the migration route. So in the northern latitudes, if we're thinking about fall migration, we might see stronger attraction early along the migration route, and then in the south, we might see less attraction if there is this real strong negative selection pressure for birds that fall in those areas. So we looked at this. I'm only going to talk about data from the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico, where we're using this NEXRAD data. It's S-band radar, and they're compatible to each other. But we do have data from Canada that we've analyzed with their radar network, and also a couple of radars in Mexico. And we've published some of this work that we've where we've looked at these relationships in Mexico. But let's look about compare the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast of the US. And again, we're sort of modeling these distributions. In this case, we're using these generalized additive mixed models. So including all these same predictors that we've been hearing about, things, different land cover types, year, season, NDVI, distance from a coastline, but also distance from this artificial light. And so what we found was that looking over here on the right, these are the responses to artificial light, proximity to these bright areas. So the top panel shows the data from the Great Lakes in the north, the lower panel, the data from the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so in red is the autumn response and the blue is the spring response. So one of the things that we noticed right away was that, within about 8 kilometers from the coast, it didn't matter, every season and both regions show these sharp increases very close to these urban areas. So that seems to be, there's this consistent sort of, I'll call it short scale attraction, within 8 kilometers from these radars. But then beyond that, we're getting some differences where, and I've marked here, this sort of blue horizontal line kind of marks at this sort of transition at about 35 kilometers out, where you start to see differences in the relative densities of birds with distance from light between the seasons. So, within 35 kilometers of these bright areas, we do see higher bird densities during the fall compared to the spring. But once you get beyond 35 kilometers, we start to see higher densities of birds in the spring. So there's like this cohort of migrants that are avoiding these urban areas in the spring, right? And so beyond 35 kilometers, their densities are higher than they are relative to the fall. So, so that's our indication that, yeah, associations seem to be stronger during the fall, mostly because of this sort of increasing density away from bright areas that we see in the spring. Whereas in the fall, it's rather monotonic decline in the north. But in the south, we have this initial sort of increase close to bright light, but then it pretty much just flattens out. So this broad scale attraction doesn't seem to be as strong in the south during fall compared to the north. And during spring, those relationships with bright light seem to be pretty consistent in the north and the south. So we do have evidence that during the fall, along the migration route, it does seem like attraction is getting weaker as you move from the north to the south. So we sort of have evidence for both of these predictions, right? And so we have really nice sort of evidence that artificial light in general is affecting the stopover distributions of birds across North America. So not only just in, Indiana that Jessica showed, or the Great Lakes region, but along the Gulf of Mexico, the northeastern US, and I could say in Canada and Mexico also we're seeing attraction. But it does vary between seasons, which we think might be related to this change in sort of the age ratio of the population, and also along the routes, at least some evidence of that. And so the bottom line here is that these natural areas that are near and within cities play an outsized role in supporting migrants. And so when we think about conservation efforts, it may be that we need to better understand how well these migrants are doing in these urban parks, in green spaces, and especially in suburban areas, and trying to improve the quality of those areas for migrants during passage. And so looking forward, we're trying to continue to build the data set. So Frida is going to talk a little bit later. And so her project is really trying to build out, map stopover across the continent, really. So hopefully we can continue to ask these questions as we analyze data from more regions across the US. And we're also interested in looking at these finer scale patterns. So Emily had showed, we can look at distributions within seasons, sort of spatially, right? And how they change over time within a season. And we'd like to also look to see if these relationships with artificial light change within season. Because you might predict, okay, maybe it gets weaker within a season in the same area. Again, or maybe it changes in relation to when adults and young are moving through and the changes in those age ratios through that region. So, and what I guess a question I'd like to pose to people that are doing banding efforts is this might be a good opportunity to sort of, given these patterns we see in the radar data, is to ask within the banding data whether we see differences in age ratios of migrants in relation to proximity to urban areas, especially in the fall. Because if we could see that these urban areas in the fall tend to have more young bird, that would help provide even further evidence that this attraction of young birds may be driving these patterns that we're seeing in the radar data. So with that, yeah, I want to acknowledge all the different sponsors for these various projects, and we'll move on to our next speaker. So I'm going to stop my share. And so our next speaker is going to be, we're switching gears now. This is to talking about acoustics and thinking about song repertoire of Bewick's Wrens. And Jay McEntee, who's an assistant professor in the biology department at Missouri State University, is going to talk about some of his research. So I'll hand it over to Jay.
Thanks, Jeff. This has been really exciting to get to learn about the Midwest Migration Network. For me, I come from more of a evolutionary biology background. Oh, I need to reshare this so I can make sure I'm sharing my sound with you all. Oh, there we go. And so I had just recently moved to Missouri State University last year, and have started very recently this project on Bewick's Wrens and started to become interested in their migration, the population that lives in Missouri, and got connected with Sarah Kendrick, who told me I should join in on this conference. And so I'm going to talk to you a bit about this project that's definitely more on the kind of behavioral end of things and not using these really great big data sets to think about kind of movement of biomass, and this is more a particular species going on here. But I am interested in acoustics and would love to connect with people who have an interest in doing acoustic monitoring. I've thought of putting up some autonomous recording units here in the Ozarks, where I'm based. So hopefully this is an enjoyable curveball a bit for people, and I'd love to touch base with people who have interest in acoustics and in migratory birds. So with that, I'll start. So I'm going to talk about geographic variation in song repertoires of Bewick's Wrens. And most of this work is being done by a master's student who's new to my lab, whose name is Zach Vickers. He's shown here. And we just started this work in the middle of May. So this is an update on the early goings of this project. Okay. So what we're interested in is how different factors affecting populations might impact song repertoires and song cultures in song learning species. And there's the idea, generally speaking, that limited population density or low population sizes can lead to reductions in the complexity of song cultures or into reductions of individual song repertoires and song learning species. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean about this, just kind of mechanically. If we think about a bird, that's this one in the center here, who's got a purple shadow there, who's going to learn song. It's going to learn song from some of its neighbors, older males in a population, let's say. If it's in a high density population, it has the opportunity to learn from a lot of individuals. And if this is a species that exhibits song repertoires where each individual sings a number of different song types in similar circumstances, this individual that's learning has the opportunity to learn a lot of different song types potentially, and some across all of these individuals that it comes into contact with. And if we think instead of a bird that's occurring in a low density situation, it might only come across a couple of other individuals and only have the chance to learn songs from those couple other individuals. And it might end up with a smaller song repertoire as a consequence, just because it's not able to sample many of the song types that are exhibited at a population level. And so that's kind of the hypothesis that we're interested in testing here. And there's some good empirical evidence for this kind of thing going on in a number of species. And probably the best example of that is in this bird called Dupont's lark, which occurs in Spain and Morocco. And some work by Paula Laiolo and Jose Tea has shown that indeed in small populations, usually small isolated populations in this species of Dupont's lark, individuals have reduced repertoire sizes. They sing a lower number of song types. And not only that, but if you look at the relationship between song diversity at the individual level and population growth, there's this correlation between song diversity and population growth. So if you find a population where individuals are singing small numbers of songs, those populations tend to be declining. And so this is a bit like thinking about conservation genetics. If we find populations that are kind of depauperate in terms of allele numbers, we get a similar thing going on with song. And so there's some relevance to studying this for conservation, because we might be able to predict which populations are at risk of being extirpated. So with these things in mind, so our initial goal for this project is to look at the relationship between repertoire size and population density in Bewick's wren, which is kind of a famous song learning bird in the song learning literature, because it was one of the species that was kind of studied early on to figure out where Bewick's wrens learned their songs, where an individual learns its songs. And it turns out it learns from other males in its population, not just from its father, for example, but it samples across the population to build up its own song repertoire. And we're going to test this overarching hypothesis that repertoire size is limited by population density. So we should see a positive relationship between repertoire size and population density. So Bewick's wren makes for a really good species to study this question, both because of its particular song system and because it has this really interesting history. So it was discovered or made known to science about 1821. And many of you probably know the story a lot better than I do, since I'm new to the Midwest. But over the next century, following when it was made known to science, Bewick's wrens expanded wildly. They had this radical range expansion, moved up into the northern part of the Midwest, into Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and all the way northeast to upstate New York, and then occurred down into the Appalachian Mountains and in points further west within the Midwest. So there was that radical expansion, and then the next century of time, between 1920 and now, saw this amazing decline where these birds rapidly declined and became extirpated from most parts of this newly gained part of their range, such that now we don't have any sort of sustained populations east of the Mississippi. And we're left with this really scarce distribution of Bewick's wrens within Missouri and within eastern Kansas. So we have this really sparse population of Bewick's wrens here. And so part of what we can do is look at this question. We can use these really low densities of Bewick's wrens to look at this question about reduced song repertoires here. So what does a Bewick's wren song repertoire look like? Oh, I jumped ahead, excuse me. So this is just giving you an impression. This map from eBird is showing you where the populations are currently that are migratory populations that remain here in red, and where we have resident populations here in purple. So you can see our populations of initial interest here in Missouri. They're kind of low saturation on this map, so that means they're scarce here, and they're migratory because they're in red. If we go far, not too far to the southwest, we can encounter some higher density populations that are resident populations in Oklahoma and Texas. where we're planning on sampling pretty soon. So this is what songs of the Bewick Wren look like. And so I'm showing you sonograms here from, these are two song types from the same individual. And I will tell you these two song types were recorded from an individual in Maryland in 1978. And so these recordings were sent to us by Don Kruzma, who studied Bewick Wrens for a long time. He just digitized these recordings, had never analyzed them, and sent them to us. So I'm going to play you these songs, and keep in mind they come from this now extirpated population. So despite that being a pretty sad story, this is kind of neat to be able to listen to these birds that no longer exist here. So you can see that we have on the top and the bottom 2 different song types. So if you look at the sonograms here, they look different. And you might be able to hear that if we play these songs. So I'm going to go ahead and play them for you. There's this first song type on the top. Here's the second one on the bottom. So luckily these birds have this way of singing that makes it fairly easy to score their song types. They tend to sing one song type in a row a bunch of times. So we call this song type A and song type B. They tend to sing when they're singing bouts, song type A, and then they'll switch to B, sing B, 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 and it makes it fairly easy to score their repertoires. It's not always that simple, but it is enough of the time that it ends up being pretty easy to score them. They start repeating these song types at some point. And so it's pretty straightforward to do this. What I'm going to show you now is this relationship. So you have song repertoire size on the y-axis and a measure of abundance or density from breeding bird survey data on the x-axis. And the initial data I'm showing you comes from a previous study that was interested in geographic variation in song repertoires that was published by Don Kruzma in 1985. He was interested in other questions related to geographic variation, so he never pursued this idea about density. And what we can see, if we just plot out his data, we're starting to get some inkling of this positive relationship here. These dots are medians and these bars are ranges. That's how he presented the data in this manuscript from 1985. So I'm going to add in now what we've been able to do so far just this year. So it turned out, getting out and recording songs by yourself of a bird was a COVID-friendly activity enough that we were able to collect some data. We had plans to get into Texas and Oklahoma this year, but we're only able to get out into Missouri. And then I'll also show you some data that came from this extirpated population in Maryland. So if we add in our new points, this set of points here, if you can see my cursor, these come from Missouri birds. And this set of points here comes from Maryland, from this extirpated population. So we're starting to get this impression that this relationship between song repertoire size and density is a real thing in Bewick's Wren. There are some caveats to this, but it's going in a direction that is strong enough that it's really surprising me, because this is exactly what we predicted. And things almost never turn out as you expect in biology, as I'm sure you know. So this is sort of surprising. So one thing to consider here is that we have only sampled ourselves so far from this eastern lineage, what turns out to be an eastern lineage of Bewick's Wren. Some as yet unpublished work that comes from Keith Barker and Mark Robbins and another collaborator have shown that there's actually some deep genetic divisions within Bewick's Wren. And so there are these 3 major lineages, one in the east, one in the kind of Pacific states, and some birds from Mexico that make it up into southern Arizona and New Mexico. And you can see that some of the variation here can also be explained perhaps by belonging to these different lineages. So it might be that Pacific lineages just have greater repertoire sizes than do eastern lineage birds. So we need to kind of tease that out. So one of the things that's going to help us do that is that within the eastern lineage, we can sample these areas that have really high densities. For example, down nearby the Edwards Plateau in Texas, this eastern lineage occurs at really high density, kind of out here on this graph. So we're going to be able to kind of tease apart this question about lineages from densities in that way. On the conservation, thinking about conservation. So if it's true that the repertoire sizes can help us predict which populations are at risk of extirpation, These Maryland birds had repertoire sizes that were small just before going extinct. And some of our repertoire sizes from Missouri, contemporary Missouri, we have one that's less than any of these repertoire sizes from Maryland, and we have some that are about equivalent. There are a lot of people who would not bet on the Missouri population lasting a long time into the future, and these song repertoire sizes don't give us a story that gives us much more confidence in this population lasting a long time if these repertoire sizes are correlated with population level viabilities. So that's not exactly a happy story, but we get some information here that at least we might kind of be able to predict which populations are at most risk. So this conference has made me start to think about another issue, which is migratory connectivity. We are, of course, interested in knowing where our birds in Missouri overwinter. It's unknown yet. And so I actually got connected to this group because I was interested in the MODIS network and putting some radios on our birds from Missouri, seeing where they end up in the non-breeding season. It could be down here in eastern Texas. They might, buddy up with these birds that are resident birds in Texas and Oklahoma during the non-breeding season. We'd like to know that. But one thing that this has made me wonder is that since we're seeing some geographic variation in these repertoires, we might be able to learn something about where birds winter based on their songs or based on other vocalizations. So that's something that I'd like to connect with people on as well. And just as kind of a bid to try to get some more interest for the MODIS network, for our purposes, we need some towers, we need some MODIS receivers down here in Oklahoma and Arkansas, a little bit outside of the Great Lakes states, and in eastern Texas and Louisiana. So if people have an interest in trying to put some MODIS towers up, receivers up in that area, I'd be interested in talking to them about that. So let me just acknowledge Missouri State University and these individuals for their help with the project. And I assume we don't have enough time for questions, but I'd like to connect with people later on or in the discussion or in the chat to talk with people about any shared interest in acoustics. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Jay. That was a really interesting talk, and glad you're keeping the memory of the eastern populations of Bewick's wrens alive. And we're still learning about them. So our next speaker is going to be Freda Guo, who is a PhD student in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University, but she's coming to us from the other side of the globe right now, so where it's about almost midnight there. So thanks, Freda, for joining us. Sorry it's so late for you, but we're going to get back to talking more about radar analysis of stopover distributions of birds. So take it away, Freda.
All right, thank you. Can you see my screen and hear my voice clearly?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here and listening to my talk. Today, I'm going to talk about using radar and eBird data to map continental stopover hotspots of migratory land birds in North America. So scaling a little bit further up from what Jessica and Emily has talked about. As Jeff mentioned, this is an ongoing project. So in this talk, I'm going to emphasize on the overall framework and the research idea with a little bit of preliminary results that I hope you will find interesting. So let's begin. Okay, as we all know, stopover sites are important for the full life cycle conservation of migratory birds. But unlike shorebirds and waterfowls, of which we know pretty well where the distinct concentration sites are, we don't really know as much for the land birds. So the question really becomes, do persistent hotspots exist for land birds at continental scales? And if so, where they are? But before we start looking for these hotspots, it is important to list some of the key defining characteristics of a stopover hotspot. So firstly, density of course matters, as has been assessed frequently in previous studies, because areas where large amount of birds concentrate are important along migration pathway and could have potential bottleneck effect if the habitat is destructed. But in addition to density, stopover duration also matters because it's actually the product of these two, density times duration, that determines, for example, how much food a site is providing to the entire migrating population, which is a very important factor determining the migration success rate. And unlike the density variable, there isn't enough data on the duration perspective, so this aspect has been less frequently assessed. And lastly, in order to, given the limited conservation resources, we have to prioritize on the sites that are consistently used across years to achieve the maximum conservation outcome. And here I'm using year as the basic unit for comparison because migration itself is a biannual process, and spring and fall and birds may use different migration pathways in spring and fall. So as you can see, in order to assess all these three aspects, we need large amount of data with high spatial and temporal coverage, and that is beyond the scope of normal field works. That's why we need to turn to big data. And there are two well-known big data sources in ornithology. One is the NextRad weather radar system in the United States, and the other is the eBird citizen science database. So a brief summary, a brief overview of these two data sets. NextRad has the advantage of almost systematic survey because of the well-distributed radar stations across the continent, and for the fact that all these radars are actively surveying the atmosphere every 5 to 10 minutes. Whereas eBird observations are more subjective to individual bird watchers' own preference. But the major advantage of eBird, though, is that it allows us to identify species composition, which is beyond the capacity of radars. And in our project, we're planning to combine the strengths of these two data sets so as to generate some robust result to map out the stopover sites. So now let's first talk about the radar data. So this, I'm sure you've heard this multiple times in previous talks, and this curve is actually similar, shared a similar concept with the graph, the very nice graph that Jessica has shown earlier. So the x-axis is the decimal hour near sunset, and the y-axis is reflectivity. So basically, we're analyzing the radar images across time, and then we're sampling at the time point when there is maximum change in reflectivity. So that is like the inflection point, and so that we can map out on-ground stopover density. And the idea to generate seasonal stopover density is then to stack all these nightly images within a migration season so that we can get this metric of seasonal density. And if you recall the three characteristics that I listed earlier, here in radar, we can only assess density but not duration because radar could only detect when the birds are taking off, and we never know when they actually landed. So duration is beyond the capacity of radar data. As for the interannual consistency, we can compare that. We can assess that by comparing multiple years of data. So radar can assess 2 out of 3 aspects of the hotspot characteristics. And here I'm showing you the example of Houston radar stations in Texas. On the left is a spring migration, on the right is a fall migration. So lighter color shows lower density and darker color shows higher density. And you can see that there are dark patches highlighted, which is actually the Harris County Park area, a well-known birding sites for those Trans-Gulf migrants. And in our project, we're planning to expand this to continental-wide to the eastern part of the United States. And the reason why we chose to focus on this area is because it's the same region that are experiencing the sharpest migration population decline as found in the Rosenberg study. So we hope that this result can help to to protect this declining migratory population in the eastern parts of the United States. But as I said before, radar has its own limitations. One is that it cannot identify species composition, and two, it cannot assess stopover duration. And that's why we add the eBird component to this project. And as I talk about eBird, I'm sure many of you will think about the potential biases and variations of this kind of semi-structured citizen science data. But for example, people may have different preference about when and where to go bird watching. Different people may also have different proficiency level of bird watching. And thankfully, my collaborator, Daniel Fink at Cornell University, at Cornell Ornithology Lab, has developed this ADA-STEM model that is that turns out to be very powerful in addressing all these biases and variations. So if you're interested in this model, I'm happy to talk more about it after the talk. But now for the sake of time, let's just move on to the model output. So the basic model output of ADA-STEM is this weekly relative abundance metric that is defined as the number of birds, the estimated number of birds that an expert bird watcher can see per unit effort. So it is relative because it's not the actual abundance, as we don't really know the detection probability, but it's still comparable across space and time. So here I'm using the Canada warbler as an example to show the population change across the year during migration. So lighter color, lower density, lower abundance, darker color, higher abundance. So this animation is going to reappear if it's too fast for you. So basically in winter, there's not much going on because these birds are all in their wintering ground. But when spring comes, they all start to move up north and breed there and then move back south again during the fall migration. So the idea of using this weekly relative abundance metric to estimate stopover usage is similar to that of the radar data. So again, we are stacking all the weekly relative abundance within a migration season. But one thing different here is that in eBird observation, we might as well incorporate some individuals that are in their breeding range, which might interfere with the stopover mapping. Therefore, we use the range map to crop out both the breeding and the wintering ground to only focus on the migration range for the purpose of this project. And this gives us a seasonal stopover intensity. Please note that in this case here is intensity instead of density, because here we are actually assessing the product of density and duration. And the difference between eBird and radar data is that eBird is more like a continuous monitoring of the bird population on ground. So for an individual or population that stays on ground for more than 1 week, in this case, it will be counted multiple times. And by stacking them together, they will all be added up. So stacking the eBird relative abundance metric gives us a measure of both the density and duration. And similarly, the interannual consistency could also be assessed by comparing multiple years of data. And then I'm going to show you another example using this method. So it's again the Canada warbler example. On the left is the spring migration, on the right is the fall migration, darker color, higher intensity. So you can see, you might be able to see or not, that there are some hotspots emerged. And I'm sure you're more familiar with US geography than me. Many of them are located near big cities, which might be related to the light pollution effect that Jeff has talked about, or the urban green land area that Jessica has talked about. But for the purpose of this project, I'm just going to zoom into two important sites to illustrate the hotspot concept. So the one in the north is the Chicago hotspot, and the one in the south is again the Houston hotspot. So here I'm plotting the trajectory of weekly abundance changes across the 52 weeks of a year. So Cook County is where Chicago is located, and Harris County is where Houston is. I'm also plotting the trajectory of two other counties in the same states, just as control group. So you can see that the two peaks each represent spring and fall migration separately, and the hotspots are indeed supporting larger amounts of birds for longer periods of time. And to scale up to our continental mapping project, we're planning to do this for 30 warbler and vireo species on the eastern migration flyaway. And in this map, I'm stacking all the migration path range of these 30 species. And the reason why we chose these 30 long distance migrant, these two species groups, is that they are popular among bird watchers. They're also pretty. So this ensures large sample size for the ADASTEM model fitting. And the distinct features of this, of all these different species can also improve the data accuracy. And furthermore, warblers are also experiencing the sharpest decline, and we are, well, with some species of conservation importance. So we're hoping that this result can also help to guide the conservation effort for those specific species in particular. So in review, these two data sets are actually complementary to each other. So as you may notice, radar has higher spatial and temporal resolution compared to eBird. It also samples systematically, whereas eBird is subjective. But the latter could somewhat be accounted for using the ADASTEM model. The strength of eBird is that it allows species identification. It also captures both density and duration in the assessment of stopover hotspot. And both two sets of data have pretty good temporal data coverage that allows us to assess the interannual consistency. So the overarching goal of this project is what I showed in the very beginning. We're hoping to generate this continental stopover hotspot map, focusing on the eastern migratory flyaway for using radar for the entire migrating land bird population and eBird for 30 specific species. Hopefully, so that the result could potentially be applied to on-ground conservation efforts. With that, I would like to thank all my collaborators, my lab, the funding organization, and all the users of eBird for the contribution to our project. And thank you all for listening to me. I'm also happy to address any questions via chat, for example.
Great, thanks, Frida. That was great. Okay, so we're about 15 minutes behind. So hopefully, Adrienne, you'll leave some time for some of the discussion after your talk, but we're gonna move on to Adrienne Doctor, who's a research associate at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who has been doing a lot of work in radar ornithology over the past few years. So I'm excited to see what he has to present, because he didn't really tell me what he was going to show us, other than to include some visualizations of migration through the Midwest. So take it away, Adrienne.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my talk will be short and sweet. It's some very preliminary work, but it highlights a bit the importance of the Midwest, and I think it would be interesting to share with you all. So actually, for radar ornithologists in general, I think the Midwest has sort of a special meaning, because it's sort of really this. If you look at the migration on a very large scale, with this great NextRad network, radar network I often do, if you look at the very large scale, it's really the Midwest really stands out as sort of this highway, sort of the main pathway of migration through the US. And this sort of
Adrienne, can I interrupt? Sorry to interrupt, but we're seeing your presentation view. I don't know if that's what you wanted to show us.
Not what I want. Let me see if I can change that.
Oh, yeah, it's still showing in presenter mode.
Let's try it. So weird.
If you've got multiple monitors, you might need to share the screen that is getting shared. I think you can select.
Sorry about that. How's this?
Yes, great.
All right. Oh yeah. The Midwest is really this highway of migration through the U.S. So in that sense, it's really it's also really an important area, and that really such a large portion of the movements through the U.S. actually move through this region. And at the Cornell lab, together with our collaborators, we have the Birdcast project. It's a big collaboration between between Colorado State University, the group of Kyle Horton, University of Amherst, Dan Sheldon's group, where we sort of try to make these products that show you that bring sort of these migration data that the radar network produces to a very broad audience, so that people can use it for various applications. So we both have forecasts that are issued each morning or several times a day actually, that give you predictions of when there will be strong migration. And a second major product is sort of the live migration, sort of that shows you sort of in real time what the radar is seeing at a given moment in time. Now both these forecasts and the migration data are both based on what we call vertical profile data. And what that is if you have a radar, in this little image you see these lines, which are the radar beams at the different elevations that the radar is emitting. You see the radar scans at about 5 to 15 different elevation scans. And what we do to generate then, to sort of summarize the data, we make vertical profiles. And basically we have this sort of sliding window that goes over all the elevation scans. We group together all the measurement points at different altitudes, and then we reconstruct sort of this vertical profile of birds. It's sort of a summary on a radar basis that gives you for that radar how many birds are in the air. And we can also add all these birds together over the altitude column, assume a certain size for the birds, and then you get an estimate of how many birds were in the air at that location. And in the case of for example, these live migration maps, what we do then next to generate these images that are hosted on the Birdcast site is simply an interpolation of all these profile data for the single sites, for the radar sites. And you sort of lose this sort of fine scale information at what happens at the scales of like 10 to 50, 100 kilometers at what happens between the radars. You don't really see that in these images. And therefore, we're thinking that at the future, for Birdcast, we're really thinking about ways to get to finer resolution so that we really start to see these flows of migrants and how they interact and how these flows of birds interact with the habitat below them and how they interact with weather systems, etc. So there's this sort of need to get to finer scale data than we have now. And that's actually not a very trivial problem, because radar data, if you just look at the scan of data and you plot it on a map, the distributions that you see on the map, like here on the right, doesn't necessarily represent where the birds are. So in this case, we had a vertical profile that sort of shows two peaks at 400 meters above ground, and then the second peak about 1.7 kilometers above ground. Probably there are very good winds high up there, and that's why the birds are choosing to fly at such a high altitude. And then sort of because the radar beam always goes up, it's sort of, you see the areas where it intersects. So here's sort of this donut corresponding to the first peak. Further away, you sort of see a second donut of scattering, which is when the radar beam intersects this second altitude layer. So you really need to account for that and sort of get rid of these observational effects before you can sort of have a map of the birds. And the same, of course, is what Jeff and many others already in the talks that you see before have done for the stopover maps. We've developed now sort of a similar method that uses sort of similar principles, but that's really aimed at monitoring flows of migrants, where you sort of get rid of these changes in beam shape and changes in the width of the beam to get an estimate purely of how many birds there are, to get to images of how many birds there are on the surface. One of the very important assumptions there is that the altitude profile that you see within the radar domain is more or less spatially constant. And if you assume that, you can get rid of these changes in beam shape. So this is sort of what you get. This is for the 4 radars here in around the Gulf of Mexico. On the left, you see again these donuts. That's the uncorrected image. So that again shows that the birds had some funny altitude distribution at that time. And the right is sort of the composite that we get with this method that gets rid of those biases. And you sort of start to see in a regional scale the flow of migrants moving through the area. So now let's go to the Midwest. And this is a sort of a special night of this spring, the 16th of May. It was the one singular night that the live migration maps really went all the way to the top of the color scale. It was the largest pulse of migrants moving through the Midwest and through the US in general. You see it sort of here, lighting up and moving to the north. So I thought that this is an interesting case to sort of try out this methodology and see what this looks like, this sort of major migration area. So we're going to zoom into these 15 radars here. So sort of the Illinois, Iowa, Missouri region, where we have about 15 radars. And this is then what this migration event looks like if we don't correct, if you just make a composite of the lower scans. And you see still very circular patterns. Yeah, you see a lot of scattering close to the radar. A lot of bias is still present in these images. So let's have a look what the corrected images look like. And you see now this image is much more smooth. And we start to see this sort of band appearing in the north that slowly moves towards the north. You see here sort of at the peak, there's this structure of movement. If I change it from a log scale that we're used to the linear scale of radar data, which is more proportional to the number of birds, you see even more extreme how much this is really sort of a band, a corridor of birds that moves through the north. And now that we have these sort of regionalized images, we can sort of make an estimate of how many birds are we talking now about that were in this major pulse through the Midwest. So this window is about 500 by 100 miles. It's about 130,000 square kilometers. Now the bird densities are on the order of 1,000 birds per square kilometer. So if you do the simple calculation, 130,000 times 1,000, we see like 130 million birds were sort of present in this sort of major wave. So it's these mind-boggling scales that you see, particularly in the Midwest. So it's an interesting area to study, and I think that is kind of where I want to sort of close off this sort of very preliminary data, and I hope to sort of move this forward and get to the point soon where we can provide these sort of more spatially explicit products of bird migration in various areas. So let's close up with a little bit of biology and sort of how did this event, where did it come from? Why was there this huge concentration of birds? And something that I've seen more and more is really you have to go back to sort of the weather the night before. And this is an image of the weather the night before. In this case, this white here is all precipitation that was hanging in the air in the Midwest pretty stably for the whole night. So I'm going to hand wave my way through this. If you sort of delineate this area, sort of the edge the front of this precipitation area. And you compare it now, like what you saw taking off and moving the next night, you sort of see the shape of the precipitation area as mirrored in these sort of major pulse of birds. With one important caveat is, and I've seen it again and again, there's sort of this offset of a few hundred kilometers between where the frontal system was and where you see all these birds piling up. So that's one of the interesting questions that came out of this exploratory exercise is, what are birds doing in these weather systems? Are they flying in there and sort of continue to migrate before they drop out? Or is there some important migration ongoing actually during the daylight hours the next morning? And is there foraging and flight of birds that have come to the ground that sort of the frontal system, sort of the boundary at which they were stopped, is sort of moving northwards? And I just want to highlight this as a case as that once we have these sort of more spatially explicit data, we can really tackle these scales of weather systems and regional scale patterns and how they are affecting migratory birds. And that's really an area that we're very interested in moving towards. So with that, I want to give it back to you, Jeff, and open it up for discussion.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that with us, Adrian. I see opening up a whole new can of questions that we can start to ask now that you have sort of spatially explicit traffic rates. And one question I have, because I don't see many questions in the chat, it seems like folks have been asking questions and getting answers in the chat. So if you have some fresh questions to ask of any of the presenters, please go ahead and post them in the chat and we'll try to go through them. One question I have for you, Adrian, is I don't see much of an aspect bias to the traffic rates at night. And I've sort of played around with this with some other data and see when birds are strongly aligned in their movement, that even after you do this sort of height integration, that you might see bias in the reflectivity based on, whether you're looking at them head on versus side on. For folks that might not be familiar, you get different reflectivity. Did you see much of a problem with that? And
yeah, it is actually an effect that is even in the case I just showed you. It is, I think it's still there, and it is something we really need to account for. So there's lots of ways in which we can improve these sort of initial spatially explicit products, and I think aspect is one of the really important ones. So that there will be, you need to first then sort of estimate the body size orientation of the birds, which is quite feasible nowadays with dual polarization data, and then remove that aspect bias. I think that will be a big improvement. And then even then, there's still, like, in between the radars, there do remain sort of in certain areas gaps between the radars that we will have to fill. And I think there's a whole interesting line of research there where we can use sort of more flow-based approaches, where you sort of also use sort of physical concepts of conservation of flow and how birds only drop out typically to the ground, but it would be weird to see in the middle of the night a sort of huge departure of birds, for example. Those kind of principles you can put into the models to get more realistic reconstructions. And I think this is a very interesting methodological task too. And yeah, I hope that we will have some postdocs soon at the lab who will be interested in tackling this more, also from a methodological point of view.
Great. Okay. Let's see, I'm going to go back through the chat. There was a question earlier, and maybe that was sort of addressed, but maybe we can touch on that some more, from Anna Burkhart Thomas, who said, how much radar work has been done in areas that support grassland birds? So I don't know who may want to jump in, Emily or Jessica, if you want to chime in on that. Sort of, where are the grassland birds in the radar data?
I think Jessica answered it if she wants to reiterate her comment, or TJ also.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I responded in the chat. Forest birds are generally what we focus on in radar. It's not so much an intentional focus as much of a artifact of how the radar data is collected. So we can't, as of yet, separate species using radar. And because forest birds outnumber grassland birds so much, it's kind of an implicit bias towards forest bird densities. We tend to see more migrants, especially nocturnal migrants, kind of collecting in these forest areas. So it's not so much a explicit choice to focus on forest birds as much as, at least in my understanding, the radar kind of naturally leads to forest birds.
Yeah, and I guess I would add that, you know, if you were interested in asking questions about grassland birds, you could isolate data over those habitat types to look at variability and maybe where those grassland birds are stopping over. But yeah, as far as looking at just raw biomass, the forest habitat types just tend to support higher densities of birds. So they drive a lot of those patterns when we're looking at aggregate biomass. But you do see, you know, when you parse out these land cover types, there are, you know, some interesting relationships that are probably being influenced by grassland birds once you control for these other habitat types. So I see a question from Nick Bailey addressed to me. Curious about your thoughts on what degree species composition may be influencing the north versus south and fall versus spring differences in light attraction. Yeah, and could the massive number of sparrows that migrate through the north but not over the Gulf of Mexico are also abundant in urban habitats be influencing these patterns? And yeah, that's, I mean, clearly, you know, we're sort of blind to the species composition, and incorporating information that could help us sort of tease that out would be really important, because it could be that the patterns are driven more so by differences in species composition, which is also why I think it's important for us to be able to incorporate more radars. You know, sort of Frida's project might allow for us to be looking at this across the continent, and we may be able to sort of pick out regions that might be more similar in composition along the routes. But yeah, that's an important point to consider, that species composition may play a large role as well. Okay, and then there's another, let's see, a question from Emily. I also wonder about issues dual to underclassification of important coastal forests. These are model. Oh, is that a response?
It was a
Maybe
response.
Sorry.
That's okay. Someone, I forget what the question was, but there is an issue with the land cover classification. I know for the Gulf Coast, I don't know if other coastal areas have this issue, but those narrow strips of cheniers and other coastal forests are hugely important for concentrating birds on the Gulf of Mexico, which most of us know, and probably other areas, but that's the area I know best. And you don't see them on the land cover, you don't on the national land cover analyses, and you don't see them even in the CCAP, which is just coastal. And I do think that biases the eBird models, and is also challenging for us in the group that TJ works with. Some of them have gone in and digitized those back in, I believe. And I think that in terms of coastal, some of the coastal work that we're doing, the land cover is, problems with the land cover is adding bias to our, so I don't remember what the question was. Somebody can reiterate.
Oh, I think TJ had mentioned that it looked like there weren't Canada warblers in the STEM model in places where they're catching good numbers of them. So, yeah, okay. A question from Sergio for Adrian. Would it be possible to model bird densities in the air using data from specific altitude bands?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I think there's lots of ways of improvement, and and of course, in an ideal world, you would just want to know at each altitude and each point in space how many birds there are. And I think there's ways to get there to a certain extent, although the radar will also always give you limitations. So the further you get away from the radar, the beam just gets so wide that at some point you just don't see any altitude information anymore. So I think no matter how you turn or twist it, in the end, the altitude information has to come from fairly close from the radar, and further away it will always be a sort of an extrapolation or an interpolation. But I mean, there are ways maybe to do that even much more clever than we do now. I now assume that the altitude profile is constant. Once we get a really good understanding of how wind patterns determine altitude profiles of birds, and if we can really understand that and predict that, we could sort of take much more clever shapes of the altitude profile of birds, so sort of use more model data in your reconstruction, and potentially that could come much closer to the truth. And there are ways to validate that. So yeah, I think yes, it is potentially possible, but yeah, there will always be this trade-off that the radar doesn't tell you everything.
Great, thanks. Okay, so Pete Marr has a question. Has anyone done captive experiments looking at species-specific patterns of light attraction? I'm wondering if different patterns of collision, probabilities, supercolliders versus avoiders might in part be due to light attraction. Well, I think there was a recent study coming out from Scott Loss's group, I think, that showed species that, well, there was the study that showed those that give night flight calls tend to collide more with buildings. And so perhaps the function of the night flight calling sort of is social information, and maybe they sort of all pull each other into these traps. But I don't know of captive experiments other than those handful of orientation cage experiments that were done a few decades ago, just looking at a couple of species and looking at light attraction. And I don't even think, I think that was sort of a post hoc result. They realized that the young birds were orienting away from the migratory direction, and then sort of in a post hoc analysis realized that they were orienting towards the sky glow. So, but yeah, it'd be great to know more about variability among different species, and maybe those super colliders are those species that for whatever reason are attracted more to light, or you know, drawn in by flight calls from conspecifics. Looks like Kyle Horton may have shared the link for that, for the paper I might have referred to.
It's not a captive experiment, but if Sergio's on here, he might have something to say about that from his field experiment where he added the light and then used tracking radar as well as banding differences.
Oh, yeah, let's see.
I'll just call him.
We have to figure out how to unmute Sergio if you want to chime in.
I just unmuted myself. And yeah, I cannot give details about that yet because I don't have any details yet. So I'm still working, but yes, as Emily mentioned, that's something I'm working on. And it's a field experiment, and I hope to share information sooner than later.
Okay. Any other questions? I have another question for Adrian. I realize that you're just starting to look at some of these data, but have you noticed any patterns of migration traffic, you know, these coastal concentrations of birds we see during stopover? Do you also see that there is spatial structure in the traffic rates, that they tend to concentrate while they're migrating over these coastal areas, and also over bright areas like in urban centers?
So what I noticed is especially the water areas and water bodies are really have a pronounced effect, and also like big forest areas where you see pulses of migrating of birds move out, and sort of these pulses really move from one radar to the next. So although it is not as, of course, once the things start moving, everything smooths out also a little bit. So it's not as much the takeoff, but there's very clear evidence of that. And it's actually something we noticed already here in Ithaca from flight calls, for example. There's sort of, we have this sort of dead hour at some point around, what is it? I think 11, 12, because that's simply in all the birds over Lake Ontario, there's this empty gap where there's just nothing departing, and we really see that a few hours later coming over. So those kind of things really show up, and you actually see it. You see those things happening in the radar data too. So yeah, I do think there's quite a bit of structure also in the night sky in these patterns. Yeah.
So do we have any folks that are sort of focused more on some of the other initiatives that might have some ideas about, discussing how we might better integrate radar data with banding data or telemetry data? I was hoping we could generate some discussion about that, and I hope you all can unmute yourselves if you just want to chime in.
I have everyone muted now, but if you want to use the raise hand feature, then we can unmute you. That should be in, if you click on participants, you should see a little blue hand that you can raise.
So we do have just a few more minutes for any remaining questions or discussion.
Hi, Jeff, it's Mark. I know that one of the main things we have been working on is trying to figure out how to integrate these different initiatives. And I was just wondering if possibly either Eileen Kirsch or Mike Wallach with USGS was running a radar unit near our banding station. A lot of what they're working on is the ascent-descent ratios, but also we were looking at possibly coming up with a correlation or modeling between the banding date itself that's caught the next day and what the passage rates were. I didn't know if maybe Eileen or Mike have the ability to get in here and maybe where they're at with some of that information, because in the Western Basin Lake Erie here, one of our problems is there is no Doppler radar that touches the Western Basin, which seems to be some of the highest concentrations of birds. There is a private Doppler unit, one of the TV stations, but they have told me that they don't have the ability, and I didn't know the right question to ask, of being able to get to the elevations that the bird work is needing. That maybe just the right person asking the right question, they have that ability, they just don't know it. But if Mike or Eileen could possibly chime in as to where they're at on some of their work in looking at ascent, descent, and possibly down the road of some sort of correlation between banding stations and radar.
Oh, Eileen needs to be unmuted.
Hi, this is Eileen, and I don't know if Mike's on. He's the one working up all those data. We have a draft manuscript of the ascent descent work, where we actually had the radar set up right on the shore of Lake Erie, oriented roughly towards the presumed direction of migration, and it's right near Mark's Navarre banding site. So we were actually able to look at movement patterns in ascent and descent over the water and over the land. Mike has given that information at a conference, I think it was last year, but we're able to share that with Mark because he was a partner on it. And then what was the other thing, Mark? Yeah, relating to the banding data. That one, we do have some graphics available that I think Mike may have shared with you a while ago. And then what direction the birds were moving related to that. So passage rate, predominant movement direction, whether it was seasonally appropriate or not, plus the banding data that you have. We've got those all overlaid in a single graphic, but we haven't developed the manuscript yet.
So this is, so I can follow up on Eileen now that I'm unmuted. So yeah, she touched with the radar that was near the banding station. We have looked and are developing and nearing a manuscript on that with the rate of ascent and descent, with the idea with that. And it's something, I think one of the first places I presented was here with the migration network, in that small room several years ago. And with that, we are looking at just modeling how much horizontal space distances need for a presumed bird to depart from a tree to get above a turbine, with the idea that we can use this information to build buffers around woodland habitat, and maybe more specific to maybe based on habitat quality for that woodland, and kind of get setbacks or have an idea for wind turbine development. Along with that, what Mark was also alluding to with the banding data, I have initially looked at that, and it needs some more work. There was not a pattern that jumped out from my initial looking at it, and that's without, it's kind of just looking at the raw data, and that's in the works. So I'm working on the ascent and descent, and now I have moved to and working on looking at this directional movement. We had this is all with marine radars, and that we have parabolic ones, so we can look at directional movement along the shoreline and about 3 miles in. And right now I am looking at, just as the directional movement goes along the shoreline, how much of the movement is along the shoreline and how much goes out over the lake. And then also looking at if there's similar movement 3 miles in and along the shoreline for the directional stuff. So with that data, I'm working on ascent, descent, now the directional. And once I kind of get that stuff wrapped around, I will see if movement in the airspace is any correlated at all to what is being captured on the at the banding station. If there's any questions or anything, I can do what I can to answer them.
Mike, am I still unmuted, or can you still hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
So Mike, you're presenting at AOS, correct?
Yeah, I'm putting together a poster for AOS, looking at the directional stuff. Last year I did a talk on the ascent descent work, and now this year I am putting together a poster that will show this directional work.
It sounds like maybe we need to have you present at the next network meeting too.
Yeah, I kind of thought about that for this year, but it's still in the work. By next year, we will have some directional stuff that we can talk about.
Okay, so I mean, we're at the end of our official time for discussion, but I did see there was one more question from Tom Will. I think that would be nice to address. But if folks want to, I think, Stephanie, we reconvene in an hour.
Yep, that's correct.
For the afternoon session. And so folks need to, I guess, jump off and they can jump back on. It's the same link. But so Tom had asked a question about how much diurnal movements there are of sort of nocturnally migrating birds continuing into the day. So I don't know if Adrienne might want to address that. I can say that in the Great Lakes, you know, we have this dawn ascent for birds that are out over the lakes come dawn, they do reorient towards the coastlines and will continue to migrate for about 3 hours after sunset, mostly just trying to make it back to shore and settling relatively close to shore, which is what we think is one of the main mechanisms of why there's such high concentrations near the shorelines. It's just that birds caught, at daylight over the water, just returning to the nearest shoreline. But I don't know about throughout like overland areas in the Midwest.
But for me, it's hard to say something general about these overland areas because I looked at a handful of cases like the one I showed you, but what seems to be picking up is this sort of, if birds get blocked by intense rain, that then where you see them take off the next night is sort of shifted northward by up to 100, 200 miles. So I don't know what's going on. It's either that they continue flying in rain and we don't see them. And sometimes you see that on the radar. You see quite intense thunderstorms, but migration behind them continues. So somehow they fly through it. That could be part of it. Or what was suggested also in the chat, like could there be sort of foraging and flights during the day, which, yeah, when you're out and in the morning, you do see quite a bit of movements of warblers, for example, also over land. So I do think it's a bit of an open question, really, how much ground they can cover during that time. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's tens of miles or maybe even 100 miles.
But those low height flights may not show up on radar. Right?
No.
Except very close to the radar. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it looks like Kyle says that's generally true. They show up, the magnitude is much weaker than the nocturnal movements. Okay, well, great. I really appreciate all the presenters that took time to share their research with us, and hope you all learned something new today. And want to thank all the presenters, and we'll reconvene, for the afternoon session at in an hour. So thanks everybody for your participation. Take care.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Bye-bye.